señor embajador de España, señor embajador de México, representantes del cuerpo diplomático en Guatemala, representantes de Cancillería, representantes de la academia, señoras y señores que nos acompañan esta tarde, sean todos ustedes bienvenidos en nombre de la Asociación de Investigación y Estudios Sociales ASIES a la presentación de este estudio titulado Pensando regionalmente para competir globalmente, el futuro de las migraciones en América Central, México y Estados Unidos de América hacia un mejor aprovechamiento del capital humano, el cual fue realizado con el apoyo de Migration Policy Institute y The Wilson Center. Vamos a tener en este momento las palabras de bienvenida a cargo de la licenciada Raquel Zelaya, presidenta de la Junta Directiva de ASIES.
Muy buenas tardes, señores embajadores, funcionarios de gobierno, invitados especiales, miembros del cuerpo diplomático y muy especialmente los integrantes del panel, que son quienes efectivamente nos han dado el privilegio a ASIES de apoyarles en la presentación de un estudio de sumo interés, como lo demuestra el nivel de participación que esta tarde tenemos de personas muy interesadas y muy conscientes de la trascendencia que el tema de migraciones tiene para la región, para Guatemala y para entender mucho mejor el futuro de estos temas con las iluminadoras conclusiones de la investigación que esta tarde se presentará. Sin embargo, esta mañana acompañé una presentación a nivel de las instituciones que conformamos el Foro Guatemala y no puedo dejar de anticipar que les invito a realmente comprometernos a darle seguimiento a los resultados de este estudio en un tema de común interés que, como ya dije, pero también que encontré un enfoque que trasciende sin dejar de darle importancia el tema de las condiciones actuales de las deportaciones, pero tiende más a abordar integralmente las condiciones políticas, económicas, demográficas que se vinculan, porque tanto en nuestra región como en México y en los Estados Unidos de América, pues es evidente la relevancia del tema en los resultados electorales del segundo mandato del presidente Obama, donde el voto latino pues hizo sentir el creciente peso que ha ganado. La legislación vigente, como podemos entender, pues tiene que hacerse cargo de ese tema, pero los gobiernos solos no pueden atender esa problemática. Se habló esta mañana, se necesita concitar una ciudadanía que acompañe, que se involucre, que proponga y valore, pues no solamente el valiosísimo tema de envío de remesas, que por cierto, y para mucha preocupación es de tanta importancia para la economía guatemalteca, sino también darle la vertiente del tema de derechos humanos, que con preocupación vemos que viene incluyendo los temas de desapariciones de personas que intentan ingresar irregularmente, como pues en el lado positivo la creciente influencia que se demuestra que tienen esas personas que envían remesas para la formación de esos criterios ciudadanos en su entorno familiar que reside en el país y recibe de ellos esos apoyos. También a lo largo de la presentación hay una invitación a que reforcemos nuestro compromiso con el reto ineludible de darle atención a la capacitación y a la educación en la importancia que tienen, pues para mejorar el desarrollo integral de las personas, para lograr condiciones de atenderlas en propio suelo guatemalteco y también sabiendo que pues seguramente habrá regulaciones en el futuro pues más estrictas dentro de ciertas condiciones de flexibilidad que se están discutiendo. Y finalmente, pues cuando se habla de un rango de entre 9 y 11 millones de personas que actualmente pues residen sin un estatus migratorio adecuado, pues implica, como ya lo dije, no es solo temas de visa y residencia, sino que se logre reglamentar credenciales ejecutivas y educativas y de capacitación, dar posibilidades de movilidad laboral. Pero en eso son nuestros países los que deben reflexionar sobre el sentido profundo que para la sociedad norteamericana tiene el Estado de Derecho. En tanto, nosotros tenemos en ese sentido un déficit ciudadano que atender para mejorar el entendimiento mutuo. A veces nos parece como muy inexplicables ciertas medidas, pero es una sociedad donde cuando no nos parece una ley hay que cambiarla. Criterio que a nivel de Guatemala creemos que cuando hay una ley que no nos gusta hay que ver cómo darle la vuelta. Entonces, digamos, ese es un enfoque que es divergente. Finalmente, como ya dije, sí estamos muy agradecidos de la oportunidad que a ASIES le brindan de poder presentar conjuntamente los principales resultados de este estudio. Quedamos comprometidos a darle seguimiento y esperamos que la agenda de esta tarde nos dé pues mejores y más documentados elementos de juicio para conocer y pronunciarnos sobre el tema que nos ocupa. No puedo dejar de mencionar que el doctor Stein participó como uno de los codirectores del estudio y que ha sido una persona clave para que el Wilson Center y el Instituto de Migraciones ponga los ojos en ASIES para esta presentación de la tarde, y nosotros nos sentimos pues muy honrados, dado que ustedes lo saben, el doctor Stein es uno de los socios fundadores de ASIES, que este año cumple felizmente 35 años. Así que muchas gracias por acompañarnos. No es a mí a quien vinieron a escuchar, sino que me tocaba darles la bienvenida, pero me entusiasmé con la presentación de esta mañana y quise dar algunos anticipos. Espero que va a ser de su interés y con nosotros pueden contar para, repito por tercera vez, el seguimiento que un estudio de estos merece. Muchas gracias de nuevo a los panelistas y vamos a seguir con interés la presentación.
En este momento, entonces, tendremos la introducción a este estudio a cargo del doctor Eduardo Stein, ex vicepresidente de Guatemala y miembro del Grupo de Estudio de la Migración Regional, que, como decía doña Raquel, tuvo a bien dirigir el presente estudio. Quiero también recordarles que a su ingreso se les entregó una hojita de preguntas. El doctor Stein adicionalmente va a moderar el panel que tenemos el día de hoy. Entonces, durante las intervenciones se van a estar recogiendo estas hojas para que ustedes puedan hacer sus preguntas y posteriormente le van a ser trasladadas al doctor Stein, quien va a dar lectura a las mismas y que a la vez puedan ser traducidas, interpretadas a los distinguidos panelistas que nos acompañan esta tarde. Así que, doctor Stein.
Muchas gracias. Espero que quedó claro que es así, es que cumple 35 años y no su servidor. Cuando el MPI y el Wilson Center decidieron integrar un grupo de trabajo sobre las agendas migratorias en Estados Unidos, México y América Central, partían de una serie de constataciones, quizás la más importante de las cuales era que nuestro sistema de relaciones migratorias no estaba funcionando, que veíamos más como un nudo de problemas en donde la perspectiva de tratamiento era sobre medidas restrictivas, contentivas, deportaciones, problemas de inseguridad extrema, incluso en ocasiones desaparición de los migrantes irregulares. Pero también porque se vieron signos y síntomas importantes de transformación del pensamiento en general en la región, en particular y con modalidades específicas en los Estados Unidos, en México y en Centroamérica. Siendo nuestros países, sobre todo en el caso de El Salvador y Guatemala, países que tuvimos conflictos armados internos en nuestros territorios, también teníamos que poner parte de esos ingredientes en el análisis de esa problemática, pero necesitábamos encontrar un conjunto de criterios, de conceptos, de procedimientos e incluso de lenguaje que pudiera transformar el tratamiento de una agenda de por sí compleja, pero casi unilateralmente conflictiva, en algo que pudiera remontar esa conflictividad y ese conjunto de líos hacia algo más constructivo y positivo. Ese es el énfasis del enfoque del estudio. Pidieron las dos instituciones al expresidente de México, don Ernesto Zedillo, quien nos visitó, por cierto, en el mes de octubre, acá en Guatemala para el ENADE. Pidieron al ex secretario de Comercio de Estados Unidos, don Carlos Gutierrez, por parte de la nación norteamericana, y a un servidor de ustedes por Centroamérica que copresidiéramos el grupo de trabajo. Funcionó a lo largo de aproximadamente 2 años, se encargaron más de 30 trabajos especializados de contexto, de análisis de la información disponible, que como podrán imaginar, algunos de estos trabajos hicieron esfuerzos verdaderamente casi milagrosos para tratar de fijar información que por naturaleza de la irregularidad en que se mueve la población migrante era casi imposible de determinar con la objetividad que, por ejemplo, tienen los datos de comercio. Y en ese sentido, el conjunto de personas del grupo de trabajo, con el auspicio de las dos instituciones, pudimos reunirnos varias veces en Washington. Hubo una reunión también de trabajo en México, otra acá en Guatemala, en donde, por cierto, nos acompañó y ayudó tanto en la de México como en la de acá la viceministra de Relaciones Exteriores de Guatemala, Rita Claverí, que nos acompaña esta tarde, y le damos la bienvenida al flamante nuevo viceministro juramentado ayer por la tarde, que se va a encargar de la temática migratoria. El foco, por lo tanto, era el poder cambiar de signo la forma en que se ha venido tratando toda esta compleja problemática y encontrar en el hoy, en el aquí y en el ahora de esta discusión elementos constructivos que pudieran llevarnos a una transformación bajo la óptica regional. La migración ordenada es en efecto una fuente de progreso, así nos lo han marcado más de 3,000 años de historia documentada, y nosotros no vemos por qué no como región podamos llegar a mejores entendimientos entre los países en esta materia. 2 comentarios adicionales. La, digamos, perspectiva desde la cual también se estaba trabajando tenía que tomar en cuenta un equilibrio sumamente difícil para todos los países involucrados en esta región, que es cómo conciliar una mejor y más fluida migración entre nosotros, que tenga todas las garantías legales y laborales y que tenga todas las libertades de quien migra para encontrar distintas oportunidades de desarrollo, con los problemas que el crimen organizado en la región nos está planteando. Concitar voluntades en torno a esta difícil relación entre una agenda dinámica, constructiva, de circulación humana, que beneficie a toda la región, al conjunto de los 6 países sobre todo, y nos permita competir mejor internacionalmente, tenía que ser también cotejada y ensamblada con las necesidades de seguridad, de proteger nuestros propios territorios de personas que, digamos, el lenguaje común nos permite calificar de indeseables, pero que son en efecto agentes que han pervertido las posibilidades de desarrollo en nuestros países a partir de organizaciones criminales transfronterizas, que han hecho, entre otras cosas, desaparecer el sistema tradicional de coyotes que salían de las mismas comunidades y se han adueñado como organizaciones criminales de la mayoría de las rutas, incrementando, por supuesto, los riesgos para las personas. Tenemos el enorme gusto de tener hoy acá con nosotros al director del Instituto de Políticas Migratorias de Washington, el señor Papademetriou. Ustedes tienen su ficha de vida, pero además de ser director del instituto, él también tiene una función muy importante en el Consejo Transatlántico de Migraciones y dirige el mismo esfuerzo o similar esfuerzo con Europa. Tenemos a la segunda de a bordo del instituto, Doris Meissner. Doris además fue comisionada presidencial de los estados del gobierno norteamericano en el Instituto de Migración y Naturalización de los Estados Unidos. Y también tenemos con nosotros a Victoria Rietig, de origen y formación alemana, pero que habla mejor español que yo. Así que estamos realmente con los pesos pesados del instituto. Y el último comentario es el que en la oportunidad no solo económica y humana, sino sobre todo política que nos acompaña como región, tenemos que tomar en cuenta, y eso intentó el estudio, las peculiaridades de cada país, las dificultades políticas internas que en cada país esta agenda comporta, pero también los avances que se han ido logrando. Un extraordinario ejemplo de ello es la propuesta que el Senado norteamericano elevó a la legislatura y que fue aprobada en esa Cámara. Se entrampó en la Cámara de Representantes, se había adormilado la discusión, pero se ha retomado en estos días. Otro ejemplo extraordinario es la nueva ley de migración en México, que está siendo incluso estudiada por otros países por la forma tan avanzada, comprensiva e integral con que fuera no solo formulada, sino discutida y aprobada en la legislatura mexicana, y que por supuesto falta ahora, como es el caso en varios de nuestros países, el desarrollo de la reglamentación específica o las reglamentaciones específicas que todas estas modificaciones requieren. Como me han pedido ser moderador también del foro, no quiero portarme demasiado autoritario, pero no vamos a tener el tiempo para acomodar todas las preguntas escritas que normalmente un público tan distinguido y tan variado como este presenta. Vamos a tener que escogerlas agrupadas para que los expositores tengan mejor oportunidad de comentar sus inquietudes. Mil gracias por acompañarnos y le doy la palabra entonces a Doris Meissner, que va a tener la primera exposición.
Well, thank you very, very much. Thank you for being here this afternoon in such large numbers. I must say I'm very impressed with this audience and very grateful that you would take time this afternoon to come to see us. I also see a few people in the audience that have been at other sessions, and that really impresses me that you want to return for further discussion of these issues. And finally, I must recognize my friend Rita Claveria and congratulate her for being the new ambassador to Canada. Rita has been an invaluable partner to MPI, a good friend during the years that she spent in Washington and here in Guatemala. And we look forward to continuing to work with her in Canada because we do see this as North American work, so this is a wonderful extension. And we're also glad that our former consul from New York is now back in Guatemala and will be taking up this portfolio. Very, very nice to have these friendships and these continuing relationships. And added to that, of course, is Eduardo, who has been an extraordinary co-chair for this effort and has made it possible for us in our time in Guatemala these last 2 days to have a rich array of meetings, opportunities for feedback, and we hope the basis of important continuing relationships as we move forward with this work. I am going to talk about the U.S. side of the work that is in the Regional Migration Study Group report, and then my colleague Dimitri is going to pick up on the broader issues that have to do with future implications for what we want to discuss about the migration relationship. So let me start with, I think, a statement that we all would agree with, and that is that for the United States and Guatemala, I think it is fair to say that migration is the single most important issue in our relationship. That is not only where Guatemala is concerned, it is also where the region is concerned. Migration, international migration, and the connections that come about as a result of that have been a defining feature of the world that we live in now for decades. In the case of Guatemala, as you probably know, there are more than 800,000 Guatemalans who live in the United States. Remittances to Guatemala from earnings in the United States are an incredibly important part of your GDP. They're an even more important part of the income in certain poor areas of the country where they really represent a lifeline, not only for households and families, but for communities and regions. So this effort in the Regional Migration Study Group has been an effort to take these realities into account and look at where it is that they are going, because the situation that I've just described in very brief terms is one that has been fairly static until quite recently. It's the result of decades of forces that have been underway, but they have been moving in a particular direction that has now begun to change. And those changes are likely, we think, to be quite profound and to have implications for a very different future and choices that we need to be making as societies where that future is concerned. From the U.S. side, that change comes about in a real beginning of a response to an outdated immigration system, an outdated legal framework for immigration, which we typically describe in the United States as a broken system. The best illustration of the brokenness of that system is that we have a population, as was said earlier, of about 11 million people in the country who have no legal status. They are unauthorized in the United States. We are a country that is a nation of immigrants. We are proud of that heritage. That heritage has made us be a successful society. We are also a nation of laws, and we believe fervently in the rule of law. So to have a population of 11 million people in our country for years and years and years without a legal status is an indefensible, unacceptable situation for us as a country. We know why that's the case. We basically know that that's the case because we have a legal immigration system that is generous where the numbers of people coming to the country are concerned. There are about 1 million people that come to our country every year as immigrants under our laws. But basically, we choose those people, or the criteria for how it is that those people come is a function of whether or not they have a family member, a close family member in the United States. If there is a close family member in the United States, there is the strong possibility of being able to immigrate with a visa. However, more and more our needs for immigrants and our needs for foreign-born population rests on labor market and employer realities and employer needs that cannot be met by just a family-based immigration system. So, of course, we want to maintain that family-based immigration system, but we need many, many more visas available for work purposes in the United States. Because what has been happening for decades now is that work has been available, people have been available, particularly in Mexico and Central America, who have come to the United States to respond to those jobs and those employer needs, but there has been no way for them to do that legally. And so we have a system that is disconnected in law and practice from the way it is actually functioning on the ground. Now, these are problems that are well understood in the United States. More and more, there is a broad grasp of what the difficulty is. But we've been unable to change it. We've been unable to modernize and update our laws because of politics. We have a stalemate in our political system and in the views of our political parties about how to address this issue. And that is beginning to change. So the most important area of change that is relevant to this discussion for us in the United States is a broadening understanding among our lawmakers that this situation must be addressed. The best example of how that really hit home was in the election results of our 2012 election when President Obama was reelected. Because in that election, for the first time, foreign-born U.S. citizen immigrant voters voted in large numbers in a way that made the immigrant vote in the United States become influential where the outcome of elections are concerned. And that immigrant-based vote is heavily Latino, although not entirely. We have immigrants, of course, from all over the world. Asians are an important part of our immigrant population as well. But the Latino aspect of the voting has been a sharp departure from what's been the case in the past. And for the first time, both political parties really took notice. The Democratic Party recognized that the large share of voting that took place from immigrant communities for Democrats was a new voting bloc that needed to be secured into the future. For Republicans, it became very clear that these voters were not voting, they were abandoning the Republican Party in very large shares, and for that party to be competitive in the future in elections, it had to be able to win back some part of those voters. Well, for those voters, immigration is a key issue. It's very important to those voters that this immigration brokenness that I've described be addressed and be fixed. So as a result, we've seen now a very sweeping new immigration proposal be enacted by our Senate. It was enacted last summer. It actually contains many of the ideas that are discussed in the study group report. It is a very thoughtful, comprehensive approach. It will not end up being our law, because of course we have another body in the Congress, the House of Representatives, that must act as well. But it is now an official proposal. It will need to be negotiated, and it has many ideas in it that will ultimately survive. There's been a delay for lots of reasons, but the House of Representatives has now come back to the issue, and just in the last week or so has begun to open its own debate on how it wants to proceed where immigration reform is concerned. We will see some different ideas, possibly some different legislative approaches out of the House, but the House is now back into this discussion. You will hear in commentary from the United States, within Guatemala as well, that nothing can happen in 2014. It is conventional wisdom that because 2014 is another election year for us, this time what's called the off-year elections, when all the members of the House of Representatives stand to be reelected, the conventional thinking is that we can't pass controversial legislation in 2014. But that is not borne out by the historical experience. We have, in many election years in the past, passed very big pieces of immigration legislation. And the deeper drivers here, the deeper political forces that have brought immigration back to the table, make it possible we could see something happen in 2014. But even if it doesn't happen in 2014, it will happen in the next year or two. So we are talking about a change that is either quite close or is very much within the near term. And for the purposes of this kind of a discussion and the purposes of the broader agenda that we lay out, our planning assumption is that these changes are afoot and will be quite soon. So what will those changes look like? Well, they will basically have three major directions in them. The first major direction is one that we are all familiar with, and that is continued strong immigration enforcement. Probably even stronger and tougher immigration enforcement than we presently see. That is an absolute political requirement in the debate in the United States. So that means continued focus on the US-Mexico border, increasing numbers of turnbacks of people trying to cross the US-Mexico border, and a very muscular border effort. But it also means stronger controls where employers are concerned, where hiring practices in the United States are concerned, and where the regulation of conditions in the labor market, the responsibilities that employers have to check the legal status of the people they hire. And finally, the enforcement will continue to include deportations. Deportations have been a big and important issue for countries like Guatemala, as you surely know, and deportations will continue to be part of the enforcement efforts that the United States makes. But the counterbalance to that enforcement package is a couple of other new directions that create a much more effective interplay where the system is concerned and the trade-offs in the system are concerned. So the second major new direction then is significantly increased numbers of visas for work purposes in the United States. And these new visas will likely be for temporary work and stays in the United States, as well as for permanent immigration for work purposes to the United States. The criteria will be across the skills spectrum. They will include lower skilled workers, but over time, and the emphasis in those work visas is likely to be heavily toward the middle skilled and the higher skilled, because it is in the middle skilled and in the higher skilled areas that the real job growth in the United States is taking place, and that employers have a need for foreign-born workers that complements the fact that demographically the United States is becoming an aging society and is not producing enough new younger workers out of the native workforce to meet job needs in those skills areas. The final direction, the third major direction, is a legalization program. There will surely be a legalization program of some kind, which means that a significant proportion of that 11 million people in the country without a legal status will be able to get a legal status. We don't know, of course, what that legal status will look like, but it will quite surely have at least 3 characteristics. Number one, it will give people a work permit to work legally in the United States. And that work permit means very important advantages for people who are presently illegally working in the U.S. work market. They will be paid better. They will be required to, employers will be required to comply with minimum wage and other work protections. They will have the opportunity to be protected by overall laws that apply to workers in general in the United States. And if they do not feel they are being protected or if they are being exploited, they will have the opportunity to change jobs because they will be able to legally work in the United States, and that changes employer behavior. The second characteristic of a legal status program will be the opportunity to travel in and out of the United States. That is something that is very important to the population in the country that is unauthorized, because 60% of that population has been in the country for more than 10 years. So these are people who have spent years and years without being able to go to their grandmother's funeral, to their cousin's wedding, to meet their new nieces and nephews. This is really a very dire personal situation for people. But the ability to travel back and forth also has broader implications and positive aspects of exchange, new ideas, the ability to move back and forth to communities and be with people from home countries. There are lots of social implications that are positive to that right to travel. And then finally, these people will be protected from deportation. So they will not be subject to deportation, assuming that they stay so that they are law-abiding. And this population is, by and large, a heavily law-abiding population. They have broken the immigration laws, but beyond that, they are a law-abiding population. So that's what the package looks like. That's the balance of policy responses and the balance of political requirements in the U.S. debate. Continued and strengthened enforcement, somewhat broadened enforcement, but work visas to allow access to the labor market where foreign-born immigrant workers are necessary, and therefore the potential for safe, legal, orderly migration to the United States for work purposes as compared with the very dire circumstances that now face migrants, and finally, a legal status program for a significant share of that 11 million. That creates a platform for a far healthier, more humane immigration system regionally. And while the U.S. is motivated at this point and is in the midst of a debate that is a highly internal debate, internal to the politics, internal to the interests of the United States, those of us who know about migration and those of you in countries that experience migration as sending countries, of course know that these issues involve other countries and involve external factors. And those external factors should be able to come into play now far more fully if the United States can solve its political impasse over this issue in ways approximate to what it is that I've described. So to look at those broader implications and what it might mean for the region, let me turn to my colleague Dimitri.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me, or do I have to do this with the microphones? On behalf of my colleagues and the Institute, we're delighted to be here. We think that we're among friends, old and new ones. And before I say a few things about what the concept behind the study group final report is, I wanted to identify and recognize some people and say a few things about them. My first thanks go to Eduardo Stein for his leadership during the deliberations of the study group, for his diligence and responsiveness every step of the way as we were working through a vast number of papers that were commissioned in preparation for the final report and in reading and rolling out the final report in the United States. We are delighted and honored to have him as a chair, but also to have him as a friend. Thank you very much, Eduardo. I also want to identify and recognize and thank some other friends. Rita, who is sitting so innocently there, who has been part of this effort even during its conceptual days, when she was the DCM in Washington, and then the ambassador to Mexico, and then the undersecretary here, and with whom we're going to continue a relationship as she moves on to her new assignment in Canada, because Canada is also part of what it is that we want to do. And of course, the new Undersecretary, as of yesterday afternoon, Mr. Undersecretary, congratulations. We hope to continue to work with you. My friend, the Ambassador of Mexico, and it is indeed a pleasure to see you again. This is my first visit to Guatemala since you took your post, so I am not going to apologize for not having seen you in the past, because I haven't been here in the past. And the Ambassador from Spain, I presume. Where is the ambassador? Mr. Ambassador, we work very closely with your country. Your Secretary General for Emigration and Immigration, Marina del Corral, is a member of our Transatlantic Council on Migration. In fact, I was in her office only about 10 days ago discussing the next meeting of the Council. So we are among friends, right? Avina, our partners here in this effort locally, working directly with them, but also through through that collaborative network that they've put together with the Ford Foundation and the Open Society Foundation. Thank you very much for the support. And we apologize that you have to hear the same thing again and again and again. We apologize to you, Eduardo, for having to hear the but and of course, you're taking time out of your busy schedules to be with us, and we truly appreciate this. I think that Doris has made it very clear that if we're going to move forward and do better with things that concern all of you, regardless of whether your concerns are slightly different or they basically can be summed up in a couple of things, which are how can we treat your people better, how they can contribute, your people can contribute more to the development of your country. I'm sure that there are other concerns around this room, but those two, I suspect, probably dominate the concerns in this room. For those things to happen, for a different relationship within the region, from Canada to the end of Central America, to really have a chance to succeed, for conversations to start, the first thing that has to happen is the United States has to pass comprehensive immigration reform. And the bargain, the trade-offs were very clear, as Doris explained. On the one hand, you have to have legal status for the people who are in the United States illegally, and you have to have more legal visas in the future. This way, people use legal routes rather than illegal routes. That's the one part of the equation. The other part of the equation, perhaps we don't like as much, but we also know that that part is what makes the first part possible. There will be far, far less illegal immigration. And I hope that I don't have to repeat that. Illegal immigration is going to be far, far less, because the United States will continue to put additional resources at the border, because the United States will continue to enforce the law internally in the interior, and because the United States will have additional tools that will force employers to comply with that part of immigration control that deals with the ability of employers to hire only people who are authorized to work in the United States. This is the bargain. It's a deal. It's a trade-off. We don't live in an ideal world. We live in a real world. And in the real world, trade-offs are the elements, the makings of a political deal that will allow us to move forward. So what might this moving forward look like? What we're hoping that it will look like is that there will be more migration. People will be treated much better than they're treated today. Exploitation will be reduced dramatically. Legality will pervade the system, will be the norm in the system. And there will be opportunities for different conversations within the region, instead of conversations that sometimes end in recriminations, but most of the time they're talking past one another. I spent 45 minutes on the telephone on Sunday evening talking with a Mexican journalist who is writing a column about the American presidents, the summit later on in the month involving Canada, the United States, and Mexico. And her question was, will the president mention immigration? And the answer to that is, yeah, he may mention immigration in passing, but he's not going to mention immigration. This is not a topic of discussion. This is something that the Congress must pass legislation first before we can actually have additional conversations about immigration. So all of those things, when they pass, will create a new environment for us to have a different sort of conversation, a conversation that will talk about how we can work together as countries, as civil societies, to do the one thing that we know is the best for our people, which is investing in people, building up the human capital in each one of our countries, because when you have better prepared workers, you have greater opportunities for people to do well for themselves, for their families to be stable and to do better, perhaps prosper, for the business sector to have workers that are more productive, therefore be able to have more, to make more profits and pay their workers better, for the country to be more competitive in the international arena, and for the region to be more competitive in the global arena. Because ultimately, in the future, perhaps with one exception, and it's not going to be the United States probably, perhaps with one exception, one would have to think regionally in order to succeed globally. Regions, in other words, are going to be the units of analysis, if you will, as we're looking at international competition. And other regions are organizing very, very fast, because other regions have been willing and able to put to the side differences that perhaps are at least as great as the differences that we have had. Think of Southeast Asia. Think of the history of that part of the world. And they are moving very fast toward a target date of 2015 in which mobility is going to actually become a reality. They're investing enormous political and policy and analytical resources to try to be able to translate qualifications of person A from the Philippines to person B from, let's say, Singapore. This way that someone who has these qualifications from country A can practice that occupation in country B. Ultimately, not only must we educate and train our people better, but we must also find ways to recognize the formal and tacit, less formal, informal qualifications and experiences that people have, because that is essentially the basis on which countries will be able to compete, and that is the key element for people to succeed. Now, the report has 14 recommendations. It has analytical sections that deal with all of the issues that are in your mind. Personal security and how important it is for countries to move forward. What we must really do in terms of institutional reforms, of the rule of law. What is it that we all could do with regard to immigration? What the needs and the opportunities would be for the future for all of the countries in the region. And at the bottom of this is an assumption, it's perhaps a bit unexamined yet, but an assumption that working together to build up the human capital in each of our countries as the basic unit, the organizing principle around which we can all do better, is something on which we can agree. We might not always agree on what we should do in terms of security, in terms of the syndicates and the drug lords, in terms of migration perhaps. Some people may want more, some people may want less. But we can agree to work together to help our people and prepare them better for the jobs of the future. No country can move forward, can grow without having what has become the most essential element for growth and competitiveness, which is education and skills. If we can't succeed in doing so, we're not going to prosper nearly as much as we can prosper if we really focus on these kinds of issues. And I know that foreign ministers will continue to talk to foreign ministers, prime ministers and presidents will continue to talk to prime ministers and presidents, but what we must all work toward is for education secretaries to start talking to education secretaries, for labor secretaries to start talking to labor secretaries, and to talk with each other and develop programs that are as systematic and deep as the conversations that we have about the other issues that foreign ministers and presidents typically deal with. Thank you very much.
Déjeme añadir solamente unas palabras cortas sobre dos cosas antes de escuchar sus reacciones a lo que hemos escuchado y sus comentarios. Quería añadir algo sobre las expectativas con las que llegamos aquí en Guatemala hace unos días y la esperanza con la que nos vamos mañana. Vinimos hace unos días no solamente para presentar el informe acá, y también la visión que tenemos de la relación migratoria, del futuro de la región, sino también para empezar unas conversaciones aquí con los actores que se dedican al tema de la migración y para mejor entender y escuchar las ideas, los puntos de vista de ellos. Y tuvimos reuniones con muchos actores, con el Congreso, con varios ministerios, con el sector privado, con la sociedad civil, con universidades aquí. Y nos quedamos muy impresionados. Y lo que nos impresionó mucho fue no solamente la pasión de la gente que trabaja en ese ámbito, sino también los esfuerzos intersectoriales que existen acá en Guatemala. Y donde sectores con intereses tan distintas se unen para buscar soluciones juntos Y eso es algo que se ve no siempre en todos los países suficientemente, y entonces me quedé muy impresionada de esto. Por eso nos vamos a ir de Guatemala con una esperanza, y esa es la esperanza de poder seguir las conversaciones que hemos empezado acá, con los actores que conocimos, para poder realmente desarrollar ideas juntos para la migración del futuro de la región. Gracias.
Pasamos ahora al periodo de preguntas. La primera que recibimos fue escrita en inglés. Muchas gracias para los amigos. ¿Cuál es la posibilidad real de que las recomendaciones para influenciar una reforma migratoria humana en los Estados Unidos y en Centroamérica se pudieran concretar? Es decir, es una pregunta sobre un juicio de valor para los miembros de MPI, de what is the real possibility of MPI's recommendations to influence that reform?
Well, as I said, this report and this work has been in process for close to 3 years. And during that time, there has been a lot of change in the United States and an important piece of legislation enacted as a proposal by the Senate. Many of the ideas, many of the recommendations that are in this report are actually reflected in the Senate bill. So we have been working these issues in the United States just as we are trying to work them in Mexico, Salvador, and Guatemala. At the end of the day, well, what would you say? If half of our ideas become part of a public policy in the United States, we'll feel successful. If 2/3, we'll feel even more successful. This is, of course, the role of analysts and think tanks, is to make the best proposals possible. And then after that, as you all, of course, well know, it's up to political leaders to come to the compromises that they need in order to enact legislation. I think you will find in the final analysis a good number of the things in this work will make their way into our official policy. As to 100%, absolutely not. That's probably impossible.
Otra pregunta ligada a la anterior tiene que ver con la inquietud de si será mejor afrontar la agenda migratoria como bloque centroamericano y no como países dispersos. Permítame solo comentar que el enfoque del estudio es precisamente darle un trato regional al abordaje de esta materia, pero esto se liga directamente con otras preocupaciones sobre la posibilidad de que Centroamérica pueda en efecto conducirse como un bloque de países en este y en otros temas.
Thank you for the question. It's a very good question. Unlike perhaps your country and many of the other countries in the region, the United States deals with this issue and with many, many other issues by paying attention to its internal politics, almost to the exclusion of anything else. After all, immigration policy, which is all about, ultimately for places like the United States, all about membership in the society. You know, that's what distinguishes, you know, places like the United States, Canada, you know, Australia and others from, you know, some of the European countries that still think, you know, of immigrants as someone who would take a long time before they become accepted as members of the society. Because the verb that applies to societies like the United States is not is. The verb is becoming. In other words, it's a country that is changing by design through immigration and issues related to immigration. Now, everybody you talk to probably realizes, most of the people we talk to realize that in order for us to be more successful in our aims in immigration reform, it would probably be better, it would certainly be smarter if we work more closely with our neighbors. Everybody understands this, but there's not a single person in the US Congress who will acknowledge this. This is the ultimate act of sovereignty. And that is not going to change. But as both Doris and I indicated, the mere fact that we're going to have a new immigration system that will give so many opportunities to the vast majority of people who are in the United States illegally and remove illegal immigration and all of the issues that are associated with that off of the middle of the table will allow us to do things that we know are far smarter than spending more money at the border. The amount of additional money that will go to the border will shock you. I'm not going to mention a figure. I'm not going to tell you how much the Senate, or maybe I will. The Senate, I don't. So it's not going to happen. But the idea is that border controls, interior controls, employer and controls will be part of whatever it is that comes out of Congress. But that allows us to do other things that we all want to do, because it removes the issue off of the center of the political table in the United States.
Gracias, Dimitri. Una pregunta para Doris en un tema desde el punto de vista guatemalteco muy sensible. Desde su punto de vista y según su experiencia en el tema de migraciones, ¿cuál es su propuesta a corto plazo para darles un trato digno a los migrantes?
The most important thing that the United States can do where the dignity of migrants is concerned is to recognize their value in being in the United States, and the way to recognize that value is to create a legal status for these people. And the characteristics that I outlined are the characteristics that at this point consist of the minimum package that is likely. It could be a broader set of characteristics, but what I'm giving you is our best analysis of the most likely areas of agreement on what a legal status can look like. If you poll, and polling has been done, of migrants in the United States who are unauthorized, they will tell you that the most important thing for them are these things: the work permit, the right to travel, the safety protection from deportation. That will transform their lives. And with that comes dignity. We can talk about human rights, we can talk about abuses, we can talk about exploitation. They are all extremely important issues. But the fundamental solution to those terrible circumstances in a country like the United States that is a country of laws is a legal status to be there. That takes away the circumstances that lead to the mistreatment and the abuses.
Una pregunta para Dimitri. Comienza con lo que parece un golpe, pero todo lo que explica suena muy bien. Sobre todo que el marco legal va a ser la regla. Pero ¿para cuándo va a ser esto viable o posible? no pareciera ser en el corto plazo, aunque ya ambos aludieron a la expectativa de 3 años de cambios, pero la pregunta desde el lado de nuestros países sigue siendo muy inquietante.
Thank you. I don't have a crystal ball. I left it back home. I couldn't put it on the on the plane because they don't allow it. But not only are we closer to agreement on immigration than we have been in the past 15 or 18 years, but the latest signs from the Republican side of the House of Representatives are suggesting that those who put the fate of the national party ahead of the special interests of a number of Republicans who feel completely unaffected by immigration is going to actually be the winning interest within the party. So we expect that, the schedule this year is a little tight because during an election year, the legislative session is actually smaller and the attention of the Congress is even smaller. In other words, by the time that they go on in recess in August, the only thing that members think about is re-election in November. And that is the reality. But if you sort of put all of the work that has already been done, there have been 5 pieces of legislation that have already cleared the committee, the relevant committee. It's called the Committee on the Judiciary. They have already passed 5 pieces of legislation. And there are 3 or 4 other pieces of legislation on which they're trying to seek agreement. So it is entirely possible that by June or so, there will be some pieces that will actually pass the House of Representatives. And at that time, everybody will have to go back and make some hard decisions, not only on the trade-offs that we talked about, but internal decisions on the political trade-offs within each party. It is entirely possible that what the Republicans will end up proposing and what the House will pass will be unacceptable. They will be to the Democrats. It is guaranteed that those provisions will be unacceptable to some Democrats. It is guaranteed that a certain segment of civil society, of advocacy organizations in Washington will oppose anything that does not, a legalization program that does not guarantee a green card and then gives the choice of citizenship to people. The question is this what it is that we should gamble, the future of immigration reform on or not? So there are obstacles in the Republican Party, the ability of those people who think about the national party to basically, impress upon their colleagues that this is a good thing for Republicans more generally. And on the other side, the purists in the Democratic Party who may want to gamble on an all-or-nothing approach to immigration reform. So there are lots of things, that will still have to happen. But if it doesn't happen this year, the stage will have been set for next year. So, on how long would it take, that's how I understand the question, before we can bring about the kinds of changes that I was talking about? It will take different amounts of time for different parts, different countries in the region. If you look at the educational structure of Mexico, it is very close to the American educational structure. There's a lot more work that needs to be done, and workforce training systems will have to be developed, but Mexico has such institutions. They just need to work a little smarter, a little better, and they have to actually begin to work with other similar institutions throughout the region. Salvador is not that far back from where Mexico is. Guatemala will have more ground to cover, but Guatemala brings something else to the equation: youthfulness. Whereas Mexico is finished with its demographic transition, and 10 or 15 years from now, it will begin to worry about the same issues that the United States is worried about: an aging population, not enough new people, young people, to fill the jobs that will be created in Mexico. And Salvador may be 5 or 7 years behind Mexico on this issue. What Guatemala brings to the table is the population of very, very young people. Inevitably, regardless of whether it's going to happen through formal agreements, although if you think about CAFTA and things like that, there are already opportunities for people moving across the region. So unless we make tragic errors, major mistakes on the way from here to there, a tragic error that I could easily identify is, you know, some point in the next 5 or 7 years, Mexico simply deciding to import from the United States its border control mechanisms. That would be a tragic error. But it doesn't have to happen. If you look at what is going on, you know, in Chiapas, you can look at it as the glass half empty or half full. People can move over there with a letter of offer from employers. They can get a work authorization to work. There are things that happen in experiments on the ground that we must identify, publicize, support. The same thing with workforce training and education. An awful lot of people in the region, including in Mexico, have extraordinary skills that they have gained because they have worked for a long period of time in, let's say, construction and other occupations, but they don't have a piece of paper that says, I am an expert at, you know, plumbing or putting, you know, houses up or what have you. We have a responsibility to make sure that these qualifications at some point are reflected in a more formal way, because when people have formal credentials and their qualifications are recognized, they can demand, they can have higher wages, they can be of more value to their employers, and agnostically, if they go nowhere, they create more opportunities for the business sector in their own countries to expand, because they're going to have the human capital sitting there, for other investors to open up factories in our countries, and they can begin to build the kind of economy that creates middle classes and helps countries sort of jump up. And sooner rather than later, even the United States will realize that when it comes to talent, people with qualifications, it is better to work with a region than to work against the region. The United States is aging very fast. We have a workforce training system that doesn't work. Let me give you one datum, one number that should shock you, just in case you think that somehow I'm here preaching to you. The current workforce training system in the United States meets 2% of the need for gaining skills in the United States. So we have to get our act together. That's why I'm saying each one of us will have to work hard to prepare the people that we need in order to continue to move ahead. The rest will happen almost by magic, I suspect. Thank you.
Hay una pregunta muy concreta sobre si creen que el flujo de remesas será afectado por la reforma de la ley migratoria en Estados Unidos. De alguna manera, en las exposiciones se hacía una respuesta o un planteamiento de tipo genérico en el sentido de que se van a incrementar más bien los flujos en un primer momento a legalizarse, pero quisiéramos escuchar la opinión de Demetriou, de Doris, sobre cómo cree que la reforma migratoria en Estados Unidos va a afectar el flujo de las remesas.
It's a very good question, but we have a lot of experience around the world with remittances and how they behave and which types of immigrants remit and for how long. So some of the news may appear to be bad news. In other words, the more stable people become, the longer they stay in another country, the more they bring more members of their family to that country, the less they remit. It's a law of nature. In other words, for 50 years now we've been studying remittances. Contrary to what people may think, remittances were not discovered by the World Bank in 2007. They have been part of the conversation about migration for probably thousands of years, but certainly for 50 years in Europe and other parts of the world. But for the time being, remittances will increase because when people become legal, when they have a right to challenge their employers, when they have a right to change jobs, their income will increase. And one thing that immigrants from the region have demonstrated day after day after day is that they're going to save in order to send money back home. So for a while, remittances will go up. I don't know to what level, but go up. Furthermore, the new opportunities with work visas that are envisioned in legislation, and we expect the legislation to include, will have more workers from the region getting legal rights to work in the United States. So the number of people will also increase. But the real trick here may not be about how much money people actually send back only. It is that the system will liberate people to actually begin to act like investors. Investors in themselves, in their families, to start creating businesses both in the United States and in Guatemala, to begin to think that, you know, we think just like Mexico has done in the last 2 or 3 years. Circumstances in Mexico have changed more toward the better than circumstances in the United States. So more Mexicans have returned to Mexico. They're starting small businesses there. I don't want to use the example of India or China, where really the diaspora engagement with the mother country is nothing less than extraordinary, historically unparalleled. But people understand, and in your portfolio, you know, and Rita's portfolio until yesterday, understand that diaspora engagement, getting your immigrants to stay in touch, is a big part of the potential for immigration to actually do better, both by the country of origin and the country of destination.
Hay varias preguntas que relacionan el tema de la legalización con la reforma migratoria. De cierta manera ese tema se ha abordado, no sabemos cómo terminará la ley, no queremos limitar en este sentido, pero tenemos demasiadas preguntas y va a haber que escoger alguna vía para los próximos 8 minutos que nos quedan. Hay una pregunta acerca de la niñez migrante. ¿Cómo se abordará la migración de la niñez y de los adolescentes que viajan en busca de la reunificación familiar y en busca de otras oportunidades?
This, of course, this issue of children and unaccompanied minors is becoming more and more urgent in the enforcement, and it's a particular problem for Guatemala and with Guatemalans. For the U.S. enforcement presently that's taking place at the U.S.-Mexico border, there has been really a shocking spike in the last 2-3 years in the numbers of young people that are coming across and the dangers that they face and the deprivations that are part of that journey are just things that one doesn't even want to talk about, except that one must. So one thing that would be very, very positive about the United States changing its laws sooner than later is that the circumstances that force families to make those incredibly difficult decisions and choices will change. I mean, they will be gone because for a very large number of them. And none of this, of course, applies across the board 100% to everybody. But overall, the opportunity for a legal status, the opportunity for people to travel back and forth, and the availability or the ability to be in touch with one's family members and bring family members to the United States in safe conditions who are eligible to come to the United States is transformative. I mean, that will be one of the things, you know, when I talk about the right to travel freely to and from the United States, that will affect this movement of young people in very direct ways. Again, as I say, it doesn't solve 100% of the problem because some of those young people are not eligible to come to the United States, but many, many of them are. So again, changing our legal structure, changing the circumstances of those in the country without any rights has an incredible range of ripple effects that are positive. There's one other thing now that we've, you know, touched on the issue of young people that is relevant where the politics in the U.S. is concerned and where a legalization program is concerned. And that is that we may end up with a legalization program that is fairly limited to the characteristics that I outlined. But even if that is the case, there will almost certainly be special provisions for one subgroup within the unauthorized population who are known in the United States as the Dreamers. You've probably heard that term. These are young people who were brought to the United States illegally, but by their parents when they were children. And they have been extraordinarily important to the change of thinking in the United States about the unauthorized population and about what it is that is happening to people and families who have members of the household that don't have a legal status in the United States. I mean, these young people are people who, most of them from a very young age 2 or 3, have known nothing but a life in the United States. They generally speak only English. They have been educated in American schools. They live in mixed households, which is to say that there are members of the household that may be U.S. citizens. Some of them now, as older teenagers, will have younger siblings who were born in the United States who are U.S. citizens. Now imagine that in a household. Imagine 2 parents who are unauthorized. Imagine 1 or 2 children who are unauthorized, and then imagine another child or 2 who are U.S. citizens. Their life chances just among the siblings in the household are incredibly different because of that difference in legal status. These are untenable circumstances, but they are circumstances that these young people who now are teenagers and older, some of whom have gone on to college and university, many of who have finished high school and are qualified to work in the U.S. labor market, but they do not have work permits because they are unauthorized. So they should not be being hired by American employers if employers are following the law. They have come out in force and they have spoken out at danger to themselves and their families in very eloquent ways. And that touches a principle in the United States known as the innocence of the child that is recognized in our law broadly, that children should not be punished for the misdeeds of the parent. That is now created a political connection so that almost any legal status program that we can envision will, for those young people, depending on how they are defined, what ages, etc., will undoubtedly allow them to get a green card and ultimately citizenship if the legal status program ends up being one that is limited to less than that for the broad population.
Hay varias preguntas sobre el tema de la legalización y sus implicaciones. Quisiera reiterar lo que ya dijeron en las presentaciones y que aparece en el estudio. Vamos hacia un proceso de legalización, pero no se conocen las características específicas que tendrá el mecanismo. Entonces es muy difícil responder ahora sobre lo que terminará siendo la decisión, pero la convicción del grupo de trabajo y de los directivos de MPI es que no podrá haber reforma migratoria en los Estados Unidos sin un proceso de legalización de esta población indocumentada. Dos últimas preguntas y vamos a dar por terminado el ejercicio. Tiene que ver con el capital humano y la educación. Hay varias preguntas en ese sentido que voy a tratar de eslabonar. Si se tiene una visión de aprovechar e impulsar el mejor capital humano calificado, ¿por qué Estados Unidos está reduciendo sus programas becarios? Y se citan varios de los programas, desde capacitación a personas de bajas capacidades hasta las becas Fulbright de posgrado.
A very simple answer. The thing that's even more difficult than agreeing on immigration reform is agreeing on how much money to spend and whether to increase the capital spending and the ceiling, the borrowing ceiling of the United States. So we have been in an austerity period, the recession. I don't know how it feels here and how you understand the effects of the recession in the United States, but they are deep, they are extremely deep. And the argument as to whether you should be a Keynesian and invest more in people and spend more government money during recessions, or, which is the democratic approach and the president's approach, versus the austerity argument, let's call it the German approach, okay, is unresolvable. So it comes down to money. And money is not available.
Hay una pregunta que no, confieso, no termino de entender bien, pero se refiere a la militarización de las fronteras. Quisiera atreverme como moderador a reformular la inquietud de manera más amplia sobre el incremento de medidas de seguridad en nuestras fronteras, que es uno de los temas dilema dentro del estudio, cómo conciliar esta flexibilización migratoria, como dijéramos en la introducción, con medidas que garanticen el control de personas peligrosas o indeseables a través de nuestras fronteras. No sé si quisieran contestar o comentar este tema. Este es una incógnita para todos nuestros países que todavía no tiene una única y convenida solución.
Well, let me just try to be as succinct as I can in saying that for all of our countries, border controls and security are essential. I mean, setting aside immigration entirely, we live in a world of nation states, we live in a world of regions, and there are dangers. And you as a country understand that as well or better, as any country. So there has to be law enforcement. What kind of law enforcement? What levels, in the degree to which there are permeable borders where immigrants and legitimate workers are concerned, those are all questions that have to do with the nature of border controls. But there do need to be controls, and whether we like it or not, countries are going to insist on having controls. So I think that the real issue is to solve the immigration problem in ways that immigration does not become so intrinsically a function of border enforcement as the way in which our society tries to respond. Because if we have a healthy dynamic and migration system where our labor market is aligned with our legal framework, then people have legal, safe, orderly, regulated ways of coming, and the issue of border controls is an issue of a regulatory framework rather than a deterrent, militaristic framework.
Hay una inquietud sobre si van a repartir o dar a conocer los resultados del estudio. Se pusieron 100 ejemplares a la disposición de ustedes en el ingreso, pero tuvimos más de 120 personas, así que algunas personas se quedaron sin ejemplar. Pero la dirección electrónica del centro se puede obtener en inglés y en castellano el documento. Y hay una pregunta que me dirigen sobre la integración centroamericana y por qué fracasó el mercado común al no integrar a las personas, sino solo al capital y a los bienes y maquinaria. Como ya no soy funcionario público, creo que puedo hacer un comentario sobre este tema con mayor libertad. Los presidentes centroamericanos se dieron cuenta de que no importaba qué tipo de controles migratorios pudiera haber en nuestras fronteras terrestres entre los países centroamericanos, la gente se seguía pasando por todas partes. Nuestras fronteras son de las más porosas de la región. Incluso la frontera guatemalteca con México, en los momentos de mayor intensidad del conflicto armado interno, era y seguía siendo una frontera porosa. Hoy por hoy reconocemos más de 100 pasos ciegos en esos cerca de 190 kilómetros de frontera entre Guatemala y México. Entonces, ¿qué hicieron los presidentes centroamericanos? Una zona común de movilidad de personas. Se apuntaron Nicaragua, El Salvador, Honduras y Guatemala. Cualquier ciudadana o ciudadano de los 4 países puede circular libremente entre los 4 con un documento de identidad. No necesita pasaporte. Su cédula, su licencia, su DPI, en el caso guatemalteco, es suficiente para cruzar. Y con todo y eso, transfronterizamente se cruzan sin ningún paso por una autoridad migratoria, se cruzan porque así han sido nuestras fronteras desde siempre. Costa Rica no se apuntó, Panamá menos, porque ellos tienen condiciones migratorias muy distintas. Costa Rica declara 5 millones de habitantes, pero casi 1 millón son nicaragüenses, que gradualmente en los últimos años fueron migrando hacia Costa Rica fundamentalmente a recoger cosechas. Entonces, sí hay, de hecho, una integración que está reconocida pública y legalmente para la circularidad de centroamericanos en este espacio que se llama CA4. Pero lo único que está permitido es el paso franco, no la residencia y la capacidad laboral. Eso es algo que no se ha resuelto todavía, no sabemos francamente cómo, y sobre todo, insisto en el tema de la introducción, porque hay aspectos de ilegalidad criminal, no necesariamente vinculados a las migraciones, que no hemos tampoco sabido cómo resolver adecuadamente entre nosotros. Centroamérica, sobre todo después de los conflictos armados internos en 3 países, se convirtió en una de las zonas de mayor intensidad de contrabando, de trasiego de armas y de tráfico ilegal de personas. De manera que necesitamos en efecto abordar este tema bajo una perspectiva constructiva diferente, y tiene por necesidad que tener un tratamiento regional. Individualizadamente no vamos a poder con esta situación. Yo quisiera agradecer su comprensión y su paciencia. Si dejamos algunas preguntas por fuera, hay una que francamente no entendí, ya no pude leer la escritura, no la pude descifrar ni siquiera en qué idioma estaba escrita, así que me disculpo e invitaría al secretario ejecutivo de ASIES para que nos brinde las palabras de cierre del evento. Por favor, don Luis Linares.
Muy buenas noches. Queremos agradecer nuevamente al Instituto de Política Migratoria y al Centro Woodrow Wilson por la deferencia que tuvieron para ASIES al invitarnos a participar y organizar este evento de presentación del informe del grupo de estudio. Queremos agradecer especialmente a nuestro ilustre asociado, el doctor Eduardo Stein, por esa deferencia para ASIES, a los miembros del panel de comentaristas que nos presentaron hoy algunas de las conclusiones o algunas reflexiones de este valioso estudio, que, como decía Eduardo, está disponible en la página web del Instituto de Política Migratoria, a partir de mañana en la página web de ASIES. Solamente una breve reflexión, dado el tiempo que ha transcurrido, en cuanto a los retos que plantea nuestra sociedad, a nuestras sociedades, México, Centroamérica, el tema migratorio y el tema del desarrollo integral de nuestros países, para que haya o no migraciones, haya o no mayores facilidades, nuestros migrantes tengan oportunidades de una vida más digna en esos países. Y me recuerdo una conversación que tuvimos hace muchos años con un alcalde de San Martín, Zacatepeques, don Juan Vázquez, un municipio, pequeño municipio del departamento que es Altenango, quien me decía: hace unos años aquí a mi pueblo los camiones venían a sacar gente. Hoy, después de un proceso de desarrollo productivo a través de sistemas de riego que permitieron 2 o 3 cosechas de papa al año, mejora de variedades que incluso desarrolladas por nuestro Instituto de Ciencia y Tecnología Agrícola, el ICTA, la asistencia técnica a los productores para mejorar los rendimientos, control de plagas, etcétera. Ahora los camiones siguen viniendo, pero no se llevan gente, sino que se llevan productos. Entonces, esa es la lección que creo que debemos de tener presente para que el desarrollo de las personas, especialmente como mencionaba el señor Papademetriou, de ese bono demográfico que tiene Guatemala, el más prolongado de América Latina, pues lo podremos aprovechar en la medida en que se invierta en el desarrollo de las personas, en generar capacidades en las personas para que no solo se puedan realizar como tales, sino que tengan capacidad de ser competitivas aquí o en cualquier parte del mundo. Muchísimas gracias y los invitamos a un refrigerio para concluir esta actividad.